So I've been learning a lot about marketing recently. Maybe if you guys have noticed, I've been talking about like Edward Bernays recently, famous, basically the godfather of public relations. And also, too, this guy named Rory Sutherland, who is just this great, fantastic marketer over in the UK. And he has this idea about trains, and it's the fact that in like the UK, I guess, or whatever, trains are popular, and we don't really take trains in the US for other fucking reasons. Well, we won't get into that. But in the UK, trains are very popular, and people try and get the fastest route possible. And his theory of trains and the fact that, okay, you have to spend this exorbitant amount of money in order to make a train go faster, right? And you could think of like bullet trains, etc. Like, for instance, for cars, in order to go faster, you have to get a ridiculous amount of horsepower once you get past a certain threshold of miles per hour, right? As like a top speed. And why is that? Well, it's because of air resistance, right? And like, I guess gravity too, to some extent. And the fact that the faster you're going, the more air that you're going to be ramming into, right? So therefore you need a lot more horsepower, and it's exponential, right? So you're going to be meeting a lot more air the faster that you go. So therefore you need more horsepower. It's the same thing. That's the same problem that happens with trains, and the fact that the faster you go, the more difficult it is. And also because of friction, right? And I'm sure you guys have heard of those trains that are magnetic, right? That like hover just above the railroad tracks, so that they virtually have zero friction as far as propelling themselves forward, although they still have the air resistance to deal with. Well, Rory Sutherland's idea was to not invest, rather to make a train go faster to a certain extent, but to make the experience on the train be better. And so this is tapping into the psychological aspect of how you experience a product. It's not rather of how much engineering or how like much better that you can make a product. It's how people perceive a product. So he said, instead, why don't you just put adequate Wi-Fi in the trains to where now people have a more enjoyable time on the train, right? They're able to watch Netflix or Amazon Prime Video, or play a game of Hearthstone or League of Legends, etc. So make the experience more enjoyable, and people enjoy their time on the train rather than the train having to go 5 minutes faster, and you spend 10,000 pounds, I guess, over there, right? Versus you equip all the trains with good Wi-Fi and it costs 1 million pounds. Bam, saved you a fuck ton of money. Well, this is what's going on with casting. It's a difference between the marketing side and the accounting side of Riot Games, and the fact that these are two opposing forces constantly within a company. Any company of medium size, they're always going to fight against marketing, because marketing is very difficult to justify the numbers, because the numbers are kind of ethereal, right? They meld with other things, and it's kind of like otherworldly, right? You can't actually pinpoint exactly what it's doing, but and you just feel that it's doing something accurate. Versus the accounting team is just like, no, I want hard fucking numbers. How much return does this get me as far as viewership? How many players are buying fucking merchandise from the store? How many skins are we getting from this, et cetera, et cetera? Like, I want hard data. And marketing oftentimes can't give that data. And so this is what's happening with the casters for Riot Games and the LEC or LCS, etc., is the fact that they're having a difficulty translating those numbers over into the accounting department. So this all is spawning from the fact that there are two big names that have had difficulties in 2022 for the spring split as far as being casters, which is Cadril, for instance, alluded to that he wouldn't be casting the LEC for 2022, but then he eventually decided to cast, and whether that be because he lowered his number and just took the hit, or what is to be foretold. We haven't really, I don't think there's any information about this as far as he has released, but he did allude to the fact that there were some difficult negotiations that were going on and that he possibly might not be casting in the LEC for the 2022 spring split, which is ridiculous because he is on the major come up and he is one of the bright stars of the LEC currently, and he adds a lot to the entire cast. And this just goes to show that it's difficult to quantify talent, right? Anything that is creative, in fact, is very difficult to quantify because it goes past the hard numbers and the hard data, and so therefore it's just very difficult, right? It's kind of like putting a price on a painting. That's a very difficult thing to do. Sure, there are certain raw, fundamentals and techniques within painting, but it's like love is in the eye of the beholder in some sense. And this, I'm not the authority on casting or anything anywhere near it, right? I haven't ever been a caster ever, but this kind of relates to esports writing, right? And I've done a couple different pieces for a couple different publications, and it's difficult to justify your rate as far as a writer, but you must justify it in some way. Now, sure, you can justify it in sense of, well, this is kind of generally how many clicks that I get, or how many retweets on my Twitter that I get per article, or how many views that I get on my YouTube videos usually, or how many upvotes that I get on Reddit, etc. You could justify it with some of those numbers, and you can use that to your advantage, but oftentimes too it's difficult to justify your rate because it depends on, who you're interviewing, or maybe what you're actually writing about. Is it even of the consensus of the community, and if they really vibe with that, right? Because, it's a very circular thought process within esports anyways. So I think this is exactly what the casters are having to deal with themselves, is justifying their own rate. And I think I want to go back to something that Monte Cristo had said, and I want to say this is like 2 years ago or something, where he said essentially the problem with casting and why he has a problem with casting, in the general sense, as far as a career, is because casting, essentially you have a cap on your job. So that's to say that you can only go so high up in salary. So there's the monetary cap, right? So you can only go so high up in salary, but also your responsibilities can only go so far up, right? Because there is no other position that goes from casting, right? And they just, right, like Riot Games just released a position to where, you could be the trainer of a caster, which is what I believe QuickShot does, is he trains other casters to help them prepare, and he essentially functions as the director of casters over in the LEC. I think I'm getting that correct. And as well, too, I believe, I want to say Freak is one of those people in the LCS. I remember seeing some sort of a Twitter post or something like that to where it did allude to something like that as far as, something like QuickShot was concerned. But anyways, point being is but that's still the highest that you can go in that profession. And so there is no other broad scope that you can do as far as an esports job and controlling the direction of the product itself, or the direction of further entities within the entire esports bubble of even just that entire publisher. So The problem with casters and relating to justifying their rates is the fact that I don't think Riot sees the value essentially of what a caster is, because it is something that should be glorified, right? And it's kind of a requirement to have a great caster in order to have a polished product. I go back to one of the things that Rory Sutherland had said, which is the idea of the doorman at a hotel, right? So if you guys aren't familiar with it, in the hotel industry, there is often a doorman at high-class hotels. I think, in fact, in order to even get 4 stars as a hotel, you have to have a doorman, right? So, certainly at a 5-star hotel, I don't think there's a 5-star hotel in existence that doesn't have a doorman. It just needs to happen. Now, the reason why a doorman is valuable, it is a marker of status for your hotel, but also too, it's a point of familiarity, right? Because otherwise you could just have a automatic opening door, right, to open the front door. And back in the day, I used to work at the Four Seasons in Seattle, and I was a valet. I was the house car driver, right? So I would drive people around, and I was also a bellman. On top, I did all those things, and I was like partially a doorman as well. And so I could like speak from personal experience from this shit, is that yes, the doorman is actually very critical, because guests like to see the same face, kind of like have a little bit of familiarity, right? A point to where it actually feels kind of intimate and you have a connected, established connection with the entire hotel or maybe that area, etc. And you can trust this person to give you like good recommendations, good feedback, all of that, right? And so part of my job was to establish that connection, especially as the house car driver, bullshit with them, etc. Give them restaurant recommendations, know exactly where I'm going, get there safely, all of that. And be able to like go on the fly to somewhere else because maybe they want to go somewhere else. But the point is that these esports casters are the doormen. You can't not have a good esports caster and someone that you're familiar with and a good esports host and expect to be respected as a top tier broadcasting product. You need the doorman. So with that, now we have recently that Shocks, her negotiations seem to not be going very well, just from the public outset. And she has even kind of alluded to as such with her, recent tweets and whatnot. Now, what I think a lot of the fans are taking away from this is that, well, maybe she's just asking for something that is unreasonable, right? And that may very well be. Like, I think that's a good hypothesis too. But I haven't heard a lot of people talk about maybe she saw the rates at CSGO and was like, what the fuck? This is way more than what I was getting in League of Legends. And I was like tenured over there. So how is that possible? How am I making more money in a new game than I am at the game that I actually came from and that I know and that I love? That's fucked up. So maybe she went back to Riot and was just like, look, this is what I was generally getting at CSGO. I at least want that. At least pay me this. And if you remember, I don't know if you guys are familiar with all the entire esports casting lore and everything and money, but this is why I'm here to tell you guys this shit, because I pay attention to all this shit, is that Thorin had previously said before in one of his videos, or I think several of his videos, that he has made more money on his side hustle than rioters had made at casting. That's insane when you think about it. He made more money on his YouTube channel and doing his writing and etc. than fucking casters at Riot made as a salary. That's insane when you think about it. And so this is where rioters are coming from. And this was like in the past, of course. And he's like, now there's, now they make more than what I'm doing on my side hustle, but it's still not like crazy. But that's the point, is that if you come from a lower position, and I'll give this as a tip for you guys, because I know this in my personal life experience, because I used to be a valet and I had to go through my entire company and rise up. But it's the idea that you're held back by your previous salary. And that's the shittiest thing in the world. And that is such a harsh reality, but it's something that you have to deal with. And this is a lesson for everybody in the workforce, which is going to be you guys, which is that you need to negotiate your initial salary like a fucking bat out of hell. Because you're going to forever be tied to that. Because companies look and they say, oh, this is a 10% increase on this guy's salary or whatever. Or this is a 5%, you're lucky to get 10%. But if you're a G like me, then you could do that shit. But they look at it at percentages and just be like, where were you at? And what are you asking for now? And they're like, if the gap is way too big, then they're just going to be like, no, that seems ridiculous. You're asking for way too much. But it's, if your initial starting salary was way too low to begin with, obviously the percentage increase is going to be it's going to look insane. But it's because you started out so low. And so that's exactly what the riot casters are going through right now. I started out as a valet. Now I'm an executive assistant, right? So like the gap between that is just astronomical. But I had to fight tooth and nail for that shit, and I was still kind of held back in the meantime anyways. But the point is that this is exactly what riotcasters are going through, and it's because initially they grew up with the initial growth of the entire industry, so it's not entirely their fault, but also too, they didn't press enough at the times in which it mattered, and so now they're stuck in this fucking hole. And Riot feels like they're justified in giving this because it's they're paying 5% more maybe than they were last year, but these people are still getting underpaid in terms of the rest of the entire industry. And then on top of that, you have co-streaming, which was eliminated as well. And the fact that, well, say if you decide to not be a caster anymore, well, you still can't even co-stream, right? And you probably will never be able to co-stream because you have to be in the league partner program to even do that. So it's very selective to begin with. So they're fucked out of that revenue source as well. So, and I think Riot, on top of, the whole negative narrative that was happening with the co-streamers and how they saw that within North America, and they certainly didn't want that in the LEC, but also they realized, like, wait, what if a caster ended up co-streaming our shit? Wouldn't that be pretty awful? Because then they would just be able to bypass, the main broadcast, and they might create a better product than we had. So you could see why they decided to axe that pretty quick. Now, the solution to all of this is, well, why don't they just unionize, right? Well, everyone's a fucking Marxist until they start coming for your specific industry and your paycheck. And you have to give up some of your own freedoms in order, to give the betterment of the whole as a community. So that's what you see kind of going on with esports casting, is the fact that, well, they haven't unionized because there are people at the very top that are just like, well, no, I would lose out at the very end of the day. That's also why the Players Association over at the LCS is just like, they held back for so long for not even unionizing. They still don't even have a union. It's a association, right? So, and it's because it's like, yeah, why the fuck would you want to do it if you're at the top, right? Who gives a fuck about everybody down below? I'm still getting my paper, right? So that's the difficulties of a union, is the fact that the people at the very top fucking hate it. The people at the very bottom would love it. And the people in the middle are just like, I'm not sure. I'm not really getting paid that much anyways to begin with, so I can't really afford a union fee, etc. And And this is what happened over in Counter-Strike with On Fire. It was Semler, Moses, I think it was Yankos, like all those guys trying to create a union for casters, and then it didn't end up working out because there seemed to be like some in-feud type of thing. But this is exactly why it doesn't happen, within League of Legends. And people often say, well, it would be difficult to create a union cross borders, right? Because, how the fuck are you going to create a union like in, I guess, kind of like your laws or your creed over in the US and then apply that same shit to the casters in Berlin? That would be very difficult to do. But it doesn't really have to be legal, right? Like, fuck it, like call it like the fellowship, like the caster fellowship or something if you have to. And it can kind of be like a word is bond type of shit, or drawing contracts for joining this entire organization, and you still don't even have to call it a union, right? It's just a fellowship or some shit. And I think this ultimately would help boost the entire caster scene. And it would also make it to where casters that are on the lower rungs are able to sustain themselves and get higher pay, etc. Right? It would just be better for the entire caster like ecosphere, right? And this is for all games too. But just like that, there's also, this problem with like journalism, for instance, and writers, and the fact that there is no writers guild in esports, which is very weird. And it's very weird that none of the veterans have tried to start something like that. And I think it's probably because in order to do that too, everyone would kind of have to work for the same site and, do the same things. And so it would just be a little bit messy in that instance. But at the same time, all the people at the very top don't want to share with the people at the very bottom. And then on top of that, you have sites crumbling constantly, right? Like we just saw ESPN Esports crumble. And when people get paid a crazy rate at that point, they just move on to the next place that has a crazy rate that's unsustainable anyways. And I'm not saying that casters necessarily have an unsustainable rate at some places more than others, right? So say CSGO, for instance, versus League of Legends. I think that whole narrative would be pretty bullshit, and you could easily poke holes in that. So unions are great, but I think they're only great when you're faced against a giant monopoly, right? You're faced against an Amazon, you're faced against a Microsoft or a Walmart, etc., right? Like big corporations. And the reason for that being is because you can no longer relate to the top positions. You can no longer relate to the CEO or the executive committee. They are just way far out of reach. That's like the corporate office, etc. And so therefore, if you feel like you can't relate and you feel like you can't even talk to somewhat of the top, then it becomes so distant to where you feel like you can't do change. And realistically, you can't do change. And I feel like that's where Riot is in relation to their casters now, is because Riot is owned by Tencent now. And so now Tencent actually has bigger plans for Riot and makes some decisions for Riot. And now you have Riot, which has multiple different games now. So they don't necessarily have to rely on the package and the pristine image of League of Legends itself or the broadcast, etc. And I'm sure that Valorant also affected the caster rates for League of Legends itself too, because now Riot Games control two spaces, which makes them have even more bargaining power. So in all reality, I think the problem with what Riot is facing, or rather the casters that, whether they are freelance or not, or, whatever, is the fact that they have to fight against something into which they have to justify their art. And I don't think Riot Games is seeing the value of that art. They aren't seeing the value of the doorman. They aren't seeing the value of Wi-Fi on trains rather than making the train faster. And I think essentially that is basically having the accounting department take over what is marketing and, of that budget. And when you mix those two things together, then you start to convolute your company and you end up losing the essence of what good marketing actually is.